Today's episode is proudly sponsored by the Rising Tide Mastermind. Each and every year, the Rising Tide Mastermind gets together in Atlanta for a live event. This is one of the most anticipated events within the Rising Tide Mastermind. Normally, we have a Zoom call each and every week, but this is where we all come together and we become better friends. We learn more about each other and we help each other with their issues. It is my favorite thing, and I'm sure it is going to be your favorite thing to look forward to if you were a member of the Rising Tide Mastermind. That could be a possibility. To find out if the Rising Tide Mastermind is right for you and you are right for the Rising Tide Mastermind, go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind and you can schedule a 15-minute call with me to find out more. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm Trace Blackmore, the host of the Scaling Up H2O podcast. And happy Friday 13th, Scaling Up Nation. You know, I have been told that Friday the 13th are unlucky ever since I can remember. I honestly can't remember anything unlucky happening on Friday the 13th. Of course, I've never chased a black cat underneath an open ladder. Maybe that changes the whole course of events, but that just got me thinking, where does the root of Friday the 13th come from? And I went ahead and consulted the great internet. What did we do before the internet? And what the internet did is it compiled a bunch of information for me to say some unlucky things that have happened during Friday the 13th, or the 13th, things that contain the number 13. So in Christianity, of course, there were 13 individuals in the Last Supper, and then Jesus was crucified the next day, which was Friday. In Nordic mythology, Loki is the 13th god, and he is the god of chaos and death and hijinks, I think, if I remember from my Marvel movies. So apparently that is unlucky. The Knights Templar were mass arrested on Friday, October 13th, which is unlucky for them. You know, in numerology, they say the complete number is 12, making 13 an irregular or incomplete number. And in the Middle Ages, Friday was known as the witches' Sabbath. Well, if all that wasn't enough, there was a gentleman, and his name was Thomas William Lawson. And in 1907, he wrote a novel called Friday the 13th. Now, this was about a stockbroker who played on superstitions about the date to make money on Wall Street. And apparently that coined the phrase, and now it's made it into popular culture. But apparently that's just a United States thing, because on Tuesday, the 13th, over in Spain, that is considered unlucky. Well, I know you are not unlucky because you have a brand new episode that you are listening to in the Scaling Up H2O podcast content library. And Nation, we have almost 400 episodes out there of Scaling Up H2O. We're going to be celebrating episode 400 in just 2 weeks. That's going to be our last episode of the year. And I'm going to use that episode to just go ahead and reflect on everything that I've experienced. Well, not everything. I'm going to give you a synopsis of things that I've experienced this year. I always like to do that, and I want to encourage you to do that. What did this year teach you? What are some of the successes? What are some of the opportunities that 2024 taught you so you can arrive at 2025 running and ready to go. I love doing reviews so I can plan a preview for the following year. And of course, I'm going to mention it, but I love how Brian Moran of the 12-week year teaches us how to plan, because it's not just a planning tool, it is a readjustment tool, because just like I, that plans are awesome, but when you put them into action, those plans are going to fall short of reality. And he teaches us how to get those plans adjusted and back on track. It's called the 12-week year. And he breaks up how to plan your year into 4 12-week segments. Now, that sounds simple, and you're probably thinking, that just doesn't sound like something that's that productive. Folks, let me tell you, it is a game changer. It's available on Audible, which you can get a free month and this as a free book by going to scalinguph2o.com/audible. Or if you want the book, you can go to scalinguph2o.com/12-week year, the number 12-week year. We make those super easy for you to find references that we make here in the podcast with those affiliate links. And the cool thing about affiliate links is it doesn't cost you a dime extra, but the host of those affiliate links pay us a slight commission to help us pay some bills here at the podcast. So how cool is that? Nation, I highly recommend 12-week year, and I highly recommend you doing a review of all the things that you've learned in 2024. When I go to conferences, people come up to me and they thank me for telling them about the particular conference that we are at. And a lot of times that'll be followed by, I never would have known had I not listened to this podcast. So I want to make sure you know of some things that are going on out there in the industrial water community. And the first one is the 2025 Wastewater Administrators Conference. That's taking place January 23rd and 24th. And that's going to be in Frankenmuth, Missouri. And if you are involved in anything wastewater administratively, you want to check this out. This is a very exciting 2-day event that you are sure to leave with way more than you arrived with. Also, on January 27th through 29th, the Clean Tech Forum of North America is having their conference in San Diego, California. And this is all about moving trends and innovations forward. And participants can expect to have some amazing opportunities and conversations with investors, corporations, and the like. Find new partners there. And we're going to have all of that information on our events page. Water for Texas 2025 is taking place in Austin, Texas, January 27th through 29th. Topics here will include water science and technology, drought and flood, innovative solutions to water challenges, the Texas water policy, and funding strategies, to name a few. If you're going to be in the Austin area, you definitely want to check that out. And then the 2025 ASHRAE Winter Conference is taking place February 8th through February 12th in Orlando, Florida. This is an in-person conference hosted by ASHRAE, and we're going to have more information for you by going to our events page. And of course, you can get there by going to scalinguph2o.com, navigating over to events, or going to scalinguph2o.com and putting a /events. We try to make it very, very easy for you. Nation, one of my favorite things is meeting people at conferences and then inviting them on the podcast. And that is exactly what I did with our next guest. Here's that interview. My lab partner today is Walker Burnett of Southeastern Laboratories. Walker, welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast.
Thank you, Trace. Appreciate you for getting me on this.
Yeah, so we should probably tell that story. You and I saw each other at a recent AWT technical training. You had an idea for a show, and I said, great, when am I going to interview you about it?
Yeah, so we were in Frisco this past March. You were obviously there teaching, and I was taking the wastewater training for the first time. And I think I stopped you in line for lunch maybe and told you, I've never heard of this before on your podcast, and I had an idea. And you told me to write it down on a piece of paper. So I gave you one of my business cards with the topic, probably 5 words on it. And I got an email a week after the training with a schedule to sign up for a podcast. So I appreciate that.
So, and that is not all me. We have some amazing processes here on the podcast, and I've got a great team. So, you initiated it, I passed it on, and it just went through the process. And we now get to experience the benefit of that with this interview today. Before we talk about what we are going to talk about, do you mind introducing yourself to the Scaling Up Nation?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Walker Burnett. I live in the greater Raleigh, North Carolina area. Graduated from North Carolina State University with a degree in chemical engineering, which is where my interests in chemistry and its practical application started. I did a little bit in my career before water treatment in the food manufacturing industry and different operations and maintenance roles. But I joined Southeastern Labs in 2018, and my role as a water treatment consultant, field rep, working on sales and account management.
And you love it.
I love it. It has been 6 years. I am very happy with my decision. I think anybody getting into water treatment holds their breath because you never really know what to expect, but haven't looked back yet.
And you also hold the Distinguished Certified Water Technologist designation. So my question with that, and I'm assuming that's why you were taking the wastewater class, not only to take the wastewater class, but you were getting continuing education for that.
Yeah, that certainly doesn't hurt. I knew when I joined our company, we're a middle tier, smaller water treater company, and most of our reps have the CWT designation. So joining in 2018, that was top of my priority list. So I ran the math, and having a degree in chemical engineering, I was able to subtract from those 5 years required in the field. So I took the technical training in Seattle in 2022, and then the next week I took the exam, which I will plug for the technical training. That was instrumental to me getting this designation. But I took the exam, I passed, and then of course extending my knowledge of the wastewater treatment, I got those CEUs as well.
So you said the biggest motivator for getting it was because there were so many other people in your company. And I love hearing that because we've got to adopt it before our customers are going to adopt it. But now our customers are starting to ask for it. How often do you hear somebody that knows what the CWT is that you're working with?
I certainly think that that's expanding. I also think it was a little bit of positive peer pressure in the company for me to get it, which I certainly respond well to. But I think it's becoming more common, wear the sticker on the hard hat, on the test kit and everything. People ask questions, even hidden an Easter egg in my email signature with a link to the CWT after my designation. But yeah, I think it's becoming more popular, especially when we are going to talk about new facilities and facility expansion. I like holding that designation. It gives me confidence, and it kind of establishes a base level of knowledge that a general contractor and engineer know that I have.
I love that. And congratulations on having, I mean, that is the top tier designation you can have in our industry. So it says a lot about the type of water treater that you are.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on one thing that I know I've heard your guests talk about is how I got into the industry very specifically. And I feel like I'd bring up this story as well, being that nobody just randomly gets into water treatment. So I was actually working for a Fortune 500 food manufacturing company, and I was really good friends with the facilities manager there. And one day I saw a gentleman walking through the hallways and felt like I recognized him. And he had just left the facility manager's office. And I asked, "Who was that?" And we talked about it. And, it sparked a memory in my mind. And lo and behold, next time he came on site, I got introduced to him. And that was my now boss, Steve Tuning, who actually is a lifelong family friend. Him and my dad were college roommates. And we had just kind of lost touch over the years, but he was doing the water treatment at this customer. And so we started to have a conversation, and you can imagine the history after that. And even to this day, my old employer is now my customer. So that's a interesting dynamic there because you think you know the intricacies of the facility as a water treater, but having also worked there before, that's an interesting dynamic. But yeah, that's how I happenstance fell into this industry.
Walker, this is what you had asked me to bring to the Scaling Up Nation when we were standing in the lunch line just a few months ago. You said that there is a disconnect for new construction or existing construction where they're building on where water treatment's concerned. That everybody's just rushing to get the project done. And oh, yeah, we probably should let the water treater know, or at least select some things that we should do during the process so we can actually run this thing for as long as we can possibly run it and not have to replace it. So I think this is a great topic for an episode. And I am assuming that you've got some stories that has predicated why you wanted to hear this on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Being in the North Carolina area and, all the different water treatment applications here, our state and general area is growing a lot. So we're seeing a lot of new facilities being brought here, a lot of current facilities expanding. So I figured this would be a good topic. I know every water treater in the industry brings their own experiences to this topic, whether they're good or whether they're bad. But I felt like a conversation with you and talking about some of the pitfalls, some of the things we've learned that do work would be a worthwhile discussion.
I can't tell you how many times I just gone to a regular account and I go up on the roof and I'm like, wow, there's a new cooling tower here. Nobody thought to tell me, but then I also have to take responsibility for that. Was I asking these questions? Hey, this tower looks old. It looks like it needs to be replaced. Are you planning on doing that anytime soon? So it's easy to blame externally. The only person we can fix is ourselves. So I think that's probably the mentality that we should have as we have this conversation. Yes, there's some things that people can do to help us out, but what can we as water treaters do that not only help us out, but lead our customer to success?
Yeah, I think kind of touching on what you're talking about is the extreme ownership mindset that, it's up to us to ask these questions. We don't want to wait until things happen to us. So I guess understanding the importance of that, I know a thought I always have when I have an existing account is, this system or facility could be treated or monitored so much better if they had done this during the construction phase or if they had done this differently. So I think when you're given the opportunity to work on a new project or a new facility, figuring out what you would want in the future from a long-term perspective is really important. And I also think a challenge that we do see is when the project moves hands, whether it's from the engineering firm to the selected general contractor and long down the line to the final customer. So understanding that we could be a part of working with the engineer, working with the GC and the customer all at the same time is we could be the point to bring everything all together.
I love that. And that's normally what we do as water treaters. People don't understand what they bought, what's sitting in their mechanical room. And so they definitely don't understand how to talk about the maintenance of that or the people that are performing the maintenance. So, why should that be any different when it's being built? Why don't we start there? So, most people learn that a facility is being built by some sort of request to bid. And of course, everybody loves the bid because everybody bids the exact same thing. So, why not go for the best price? That doesn't always work out. Hopefully, we have a relationship with the customer and they realize, okay, even though company C is three times the cost of everybody else, I shouldn't take that because one, that tells me something. If other companies can't do it for that price, how could this company do it? And now, of these other companies that are bidding around the same price, what do I know? Who do I know? And what price should I select or which contract should I select? Can you give us some advice there?
That's a great question, Trace, and I do think the biggest part of that when you're looking at bidding on a competitive project is truly understanding what is it going to take to treat the system, right? And I think having the confidence to understand that it might not be a cookie cutter facility, whether it's going to be they're going to use different reclaim sources in their systems or they're requiring a certain amount of equipment that might be a little bit more expensive than your baseline level, understanding those, and you're probably not going to win every bid, right? But bidding on value over just that lowest price, in our experience, is probably the right way to go.
And maybe that customer needs some help in understanding how to determine value with industrial water treatment. So that's a great conversation, and why you need to have relationships with people, because now they feel, hey, I just got all these bids in. I really don't understand why this company's doing it this way while you're doing it this other way. Can you come in and help me understand that? What a great conversation to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And, we'll be touching on this entire conversation, but that's all relationship driven, right? And if you can establish that early, and maybe it's a engineering firm that you've worked with in the past and they know the type of work you do, or you're still just bidding on the project, it's having that relationship and that reputation could win you the project. And if it does, then you're getting it the right way.
And I feel that at this point in time, we're at a crossroads where if we actually had the conversation that we just discussed, oh, that's going to go down probably the better, easier road. If we don't get that conversation, and let's face it, most cases we probably don't, we're going to be going down a much harder road. So we're going to choose our own adventure. We're going to choose to go down the harder road. And now we were just awarded something that's going to be built that's way in the future. Nobody's thinking about it. We're probably high fiving ourselves because we did win that. And it's not on anybody's radar. And then all of a sudden, we get a call and they said, hey, we've had water in this cooling tower for a month now. When are you going to show up?
Yeah, Trace, I could not relate to that story any better. That is one of the experiences that I've had as well. So it was a very large facility, a downtown building, well over 20 stories. We had bid on it, we had gotten it, and then the conversation went dark for a few months. And I would touch base and make sure they understood that I was available for any type of equipment specking, or making sure we were agreeing on lead times and everything. And a couple months later, middle of the summer, when the load's the worst, got a call saying, "Hey, can you get out here? Our cooling towers are running, and all the water is red." I was visiting my family up in Washington D.C. I'm nowhere nearby close to this, so that's not a fun call to get. But in this exact example, something that I learned is I didn't set the expectations on, hey, you have to keep me in the loop of when we start up these pieces of water treatment equipment, because how you treat them first, and that could dictate how the rest of the treatment program is going to go. So, in that exact example, they had piping that had been sitting out in the rain and gotten mud in it. They had a sand filter they hadn't installed, and they're asking me, what chemicals can we add to fix this, and all these things. And it took a long time, but we finally got their system under control. But it's certainly bad water. A lot of times people think is bad water treatment, and that's always not the case.
When in doubt, blame the water treater.
Absolutely. I've heard that before.
And all the mud and things in the pipes, once it's in the system, now you've got to deal with it. There were so many things that could have taken place before that happened, but now here it is. We have to deal with it, and it's not going to be good. It's not going to be cheap.
Right. And, having that hard conversation with the customer, especially so early on in the relationship, that can set you up in the future for success, being that you're willing to have a hard conversation. You're willing to recognize that this isn't the way it should be. And as a company, we don't accept this. And so working towards what you're envisioning of how that program's going to go is really important.
Well, let's back up just a little bit because we're talking about how the facility is now started up. But in the bidding process, I know for a fact you have seen specifications for proposal out there that just don't make sense. And that's not how water is treated in your area. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I think that's a long conversation to have, and I think things are moving in the better direction in terms of all the specs on the equipment to be treated. But a lot of it is just copied and pasted from the last project the company was working on. But what we're finding too is educating early and making sure that they understand, whether it's the engineering firm that's designing the facility or once it's been handed off to a general contractor, that that's not going to work in the chiller room, or we need space over here in the boiler room for this equipment. It's there's a definitely a disconnect from a box on a PNID that says boiler treatment chemicals, and then when they mock up the actual 3D rendering of the boiler room, there's no room for anything in there. And they're saying, well, we've been fighting to get a sink in here, let alone a boiler controller and chemical drums. So setting those expectations early and, agreeing on this is where this is going to go. and it's going to get delivered and it's going to get installed there is really important to talk about early on versus scrambling on the back end.
We just had this happen to us where we were delivering tanks and we could not get them anywhere in that room, and it was wasted money and time on our end. And if we had a better conversation with the people that were building the room, that could have all been avoided. And we actually had to change the products that we were going to use because we had to put such smaller tanks in there. We had to super concentrate these products for not a large system. So if we get an overfeed, I'm knocking on something right now because I'm hoping we don't get an overfeed, but that's really going to create an issue.
That's a really good point. And one thing I'd recommend is don't be afraid to ask these questions. I think the more we communicate and the less we sit back and wait for things to happen to us, the better the program's going to go. So, for example, a lot of these new facilities we're working with, and not only do they have the PNIDs, but they have very sophisticated 3D software on what the chiller room's going to look like, what the boiler room's going to look like. And I've had numerous conversations and meetings where they'll let me have access to these files, maybe whether it's on a Teams meeting or a Zoom call, and we go up and down the chiller room and they say, "What about here? What about here?" And being that I do, this type of work, but I'm in there running pinks and blues every day. We know exactly where we'd prefer to have things. So that's something that I think a lot of people may not know is available to them to get that up front to know exactly where your system's going to go. And even in terms of like where you place the taps on the piping, whether you need multiple points or where you're going to blow down or how that's going to look, you can do that now. It's not just marking it up on a PNID and then you get to the plant and the plumbing crew, you have to search the whole section of pipe to see where it is and just hope that it was in the right place.
One of the things I like to do so everybody can follow along, no matter how much experience they have, is define any initials that we have. So PNID.
Yeah, that's a piping and instrument diagram. It's not a process flow diagram. PNIDs are kind of the final plant drawings of all the plumbing, all the big major pieces of equipment. And that's one thing we've even done is we'll ask for those to be sent over to us as a water treatment company and we'll mock those up ourselves. Because a lot of times you'll find, for example, I have a really large customer in South Carolina right now, and they've got, say, I can't remember exactly, say they have 8 chillers they're installing, right? They have a specific chemical treatment PNID that lists 8 different chemical treatment systems on their 8 chillers, 3 chemical drums on each of those. So they're lacking the understanding that this is all one water system and we don't need that. So I think getting those up front and having that relationship where they're willing to let you mock them up and say, no, this will work better, or you don't need that and you can get rid of that, and that's a cost savings there.
That's a great example. So we're having these conversations, and then there's going to be a conversation where, okay, thank you. We will let you know when you need to step foot on this site. What needs to happen between that phone call and when you actually need to be there to ensure you don't get the phone call when you're visiting family in Washington, D.C., that, hey, we've had this tower running for a couple of weeks and it's all rusty?
Right. I think communication is going to be the center of that. And what that really means is, you can request to say, okay, when are the chillers or the cooling towers planning on being delivered on site? They'll usually tell you a certain week, and that goes in with adaptability of being a water treatment with these customers. Is it might say it's going to be delivered this week, but more than likely it's not. But being able to understand exactly when the major pieces of equipment are going to be delivered and just ask, can we be part of, once they're on site, this crews are rigging them up, can we come out and just inspect everything and make sure our equipment's been delivered and it's in the right place, and conglomerate all of that in a general location? Is asking those questions up front. You might even be pestering them a little bit, but there's nothing wrong with that. And the alternative is, like I said, you just get a call saying, hey, our cooling tower is up and running, come treat it. And as a professional water treater knows, that's not the right way to do things.
Do you have a checklist that you use to make sure you hit all these points with your customer?
Yeah, I certainly do. It's probably not some template that we would share, but, I think a big part is first and foremost understanding what systems are going to be needed to be treated. and what equipment and chemicals are required to treat those systems. And a big part for us is the potential lead times. Most of the time, the equipment we spec out, the lead times compared to, say, a boiler are much, much less. But you always want to double check that and make sure the end user understands maybe those limitations. And then, as well, with the project timeline, like I said, understanding when the major pieces of equipment are going to get delivered, as well as the milestones for the installations of those. Something that I find always goes under the radar is whether you need to do pipe cleanings or any type of passivation on these systems. And I might be the only one that's experienced this, but it feels like I'm the only one bringing those up and making sure they understand that these systems need to be cleaned, whether it's just simply flushing them or chemically treating them, to ensure that when it's go live and we start commissioning the plant, that everything is right where it needs to be.
Walker, here's the thing with that. They actually sign documents that they understand these procedures, and it has, pre-system flushes, passivation. So they're getting the documentation, they're just not using it. So, what conversations should we be having with our customers so they see the importance of it? Because right now they're just thinking, I paid for this thing, I'm not able to use it, I'm losing money on producing whatever this thing is going to allow me to do. How do I get it up and running as quickly as possible? How do we change that mindset to, oh, I need to make sure I set it up properly first so I can get the most use out of it into the future?
That's a really good question. And going into making sure that the general contractor, or more importantly, your end user customer, understands that just because a piece of equipment's been delivered doesn't mean it's ready to be used. And that all goes back to establishing those conversations early in the process, whether it's on a P&ID or a general plant dynamic. We'll ask for, okay, this system, say it's a cooling tower system, what's the total piping volume? And understanding if you're going to be cleaning that piping, the chemistry required for that. And I even think a really good example that I've experienced recently is, I have a plant that's expanding right now. They are a battery plant. And as you can imagine, the battery industry is increasing in the past few years, and they're expanding their plant. And they're adding more cooling towers, adding more chillers, they're adding everything. And I've asked those questions. Okay, what's the plan for cleaning these pipes and passivating things? And an interesting thing that was brought up for this specific customer is we're going through all that. We're making sure they understand that this is something that needs to be done. And as a side tangent, you might even get more business. For this one customer, they said, oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We have this purified stainless steel piping over here in a remote part of the plant. We need to passivate that. Can you do that? And, of course, as a water treater, we can do anything with water. And so they would have never asked that question to me if I hadn't brought up the question about the main central utility plant expanding. So it's different other sectors of your business can develop if you have those conversations early. And then they can understand that you're the expert on the water at the facility and that you can offer the support in any type of expansion.
So I'm trying to think of all the different players that would be involved. We've got the equipment manufacturer, the mechanical contractor, the probably there are a lot of subs that are involved with that. We have the owner of the equipment. We have the operator of the equipment. There's probably even more we can invite to that party. We're having a different conversation with each one of those. What do we need to consider as we're having those conversations?
I think you have to consider what each of those parties needs during this process. So, like you're saying, you have maybe on the back end, you have the engineers or the general contractor, whether it's HVAC under them or plumbing under them or pipe fitters. But then, like you said, you have your end user customer that might be a group of engineers or operators. And one thing that people also forget is linking an EH&S, because you remember we're treating with chemically these systems, and those have to be disposed of, especially from a initial startup commissioning standpoint. That could be something that easily gets overlooked.
Can you define that term for us?
EH&S, yeah, so that would be the Department of Environmental Health and Safety. And their job is to make sure that not only are the chemicals compatible with their facility, but that they're disposed of and that they're stored correctly. So that seems to be one thing that always goes through the radar, and nobody thinks about it until it's after the fact when you need to think about it. So, as a water treater, we know that our chemicals are going to be used, they serve a purpose, and they're going to have to get disposed of somehow. So, having some ownership around that and getting on top of that at the beginning makes us also appear as a more experienced consultant to this process rather than a reactive passenger.
And it's so much easier to get in front of things than to have to deal with something that's now on fire. Hopefully, it's not actually on fire, but you got to deal with it because now there's an inspector coming or there's something, there's this deadline right in front of you that you probably are on vacation again and you've got to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely, Trace. And the more and more you're saying that, I think I need to start canceling all my vacations now to make sure I'm available.
We just have better conversations so we can have our vacations. So you mentioned passivation. A lot of customers, they skip that step. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about passivation. I'm kind of curious because I know we get people that listen to this podcast that maybe might be in this decision making process. How important is passivation and what have you seen because it wasn't taken seriously?
Absolutely. I think it might be one of, if not the most important part of starting up your water treatment systems. So, passivation is where you're going to clean the piping and you're going to make sure that from a corrosion standpoint, it's going to last your entire career there. And so it depends exactly on what you're passivating, but there's certainly a break in period on maybe an evaporative condenser that you need to make sure you do correctly with the right equipment, the right timeline, and the right people involved. So it's not a surprise. The problem you run into is when you bring up passivating something, right when it needs to be done. That's the challenge we get into because then scrambling to get the chemicals in there, make sure they have the time to allow it, approve the SDSs, all these different things. When it's scrambled together, that can be a challenge. And that might be, Trace, what you're talking about is when customers seem to skip that step and make the decision to skip it. And as water treaters, we have to understand that we will explain to them the implications that if they do skip these steps, you might see premature failures down the road that you're not expecting. You might not get maybe, say, the heat transfer, the longevity out of your equipment. And I think making sure you have those conversations early and often, you'll never regret.
Great advice. Walker, all of this ties back to making sure you're talking to the right people. But then after we leave, we've got to make sure that they're talking to the right people. So, how do we make sure the right message gets translated to person or team to team?
Absolutely. So I think if you're included in a project from the beginning with an engineering firm, we found that they're setting these up, these new plants, and they're trying to, squeeze everything out from a sustainability standpoint. So for example, we have a customer who's they're trying to utilize every possible reclaim source for their cooling tower makeup that the plant is going to produce, whether they're rainwater, RO reject, carbon filter backwashes, or even air handler condensate. So we were included in that conversation early rather than on the back end. And we know that there's going to be a different treatment program for that, whether it's the chemistry required in different stages versus just in the cooling tower, if there's some pre treatment necessary, as well as the actual controllers that we might have a more advanced controller to monitor different inputs and adjust accordingly.
So, based on all of your experiences, I'm sure that you have some things that could you do them over again, you probably would. What are some lessons learned that you can share to the Scaling Up Nation?
Yeah, I think it's learning to be confident in these new projects, whether they're a new facility or an expansion. So I think, specifically talking about an expansion, you're already familiar with the customer. So my recommendation is to go into it knowing that you're the expert, you know the nuances of that facility. So when they're saying adding on to another system or creating one in a different part of the plant, you're already familiar with how you've successfully treated that facility and how that can transition to maybe a new system there. I'd like to share one thing with maybe a new water treater in the industry listening to this. I find that when you join the industry, and this is just my experience, learning the technical nature of things, whether it's from a chemistry standpoint or an equipment standpoint, that might come quick. It might not take that long to feel like you understand that. But the challenge I found is gaining confidence as a water treater that you can go into any room with anybody and talk to them about what you do and the value that your company provides. So, my recommendation is if you're new in this industry and your company has a project like this where a new plant's being built or they're expanding another one, raise your hand and ask if you can be part of that. Because understanding from the beginning of we're going to choose these chemistries, we're not going to choose these chemistries, and why is such a valuable learning experience. And the same goes for equipment of we've seen this work at this facility and it didn't work here. So the one we're working on right now, we're going to go with that, whether it's a specific pump or a certain controller or an offline piece of equipment. That's where I've always learned and, cut my teeth on this industry is from new expansion projects. And I think we're lucky in the North Carolina and the Southeast region because we have such great growth down here that we are seeing these experiences frequently. The one other thing I'd like to add is it's not always like that. And you might live in a different part of the country or the world where your industrial experience is not expanding. So one thing that I did when I was training and my company made the conscious decision to do is when I was training with another field service rep, they would have me go into a customer and find the sample locations and where we feed everything as if it was a new customer and pretend that we've never worked there before. And I had to find everything myself and almost report back to this is where this is where this system is, and where you get your samples. Because that's a really important part. Because if you can learn that there, then you'll be much more confident when you're talking to these engineering firms of, no, that didn't work at that facility, but this is going to work here.
That's such a great technique. So thanks for sharing that. I'm curious. Let's say we've done all these things and then we show up on the job site. They're not ready for us. And they're like, oh, that's going to be next week. So we show up next week, and Walker, you know this story. They're not ready for us. So, okay, well, maybe 2 weeks this time. So we show up in 2 weeks. Walker, what am I going to say?
They're not ready for it.
They're not ready for us. How do we handle that so we're not wasting time and we're getting things done the way that they need to get done and we're not wasting time, I guess is the bottom line.
Yeah, I think becoming an adaptable and flexible water treater in this regard is probably the most important thing. When you hear that this is the date we're starting up the softener, or we're going to start up the DA tank, I would go ahead and assume that those dates are being written in pencil. I think a new project like this is going to test your patience as a water treater, but you're there for the long term. And so becoming an adaptable is the most important thing. And what is my advice is that I would recommend your chemicals and your equipment are not the thing they're waiting on, but everything else is what they're waiting on. As long as you can cross your T's and dot your I's, there's a lot that's out of your control that you're just going to have to adapt to.
Yeah, we have found that definitely shipping things before they're needed is definitely a good practice. But then also don't assume they're going to be ready. Call maybe the week before you're supposed to be there. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we're ready for you. Well, I would probably call the day before and ensure that. And then maybe define what ready means. Is there actually electricity run to that? Are things plumbed in? Do you actually have the ability to put water into this unit? Oh, no? Well, it doesn't sound like you're ready for me. When will those things get done? And it's kind of foolish, I think, that you have to do those things, but people are thinking about what they have to do next and not necessarily what you have to do next.
Trace, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that, such a small detail of calling the day before, even though maybe for weeks you've been emailing about this is the date, this is the startup, calling the day before, because I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation of, oh, I meant to call you. No, that's next week. We're not doing that now. And that saved me a 2.5 hour drive round trip. That's a really good point.
Now, we've been talking about new construction, but let's talk about that facility that we have that they tied a new piece of equipment into an existing structure. Does all of this stand the same, or are there nuances that we have to do differently?
No, there's certainly nuances to that. And I think all of that goes into what is the expectation the customer is going to have with us. As you can imagine, if you're expanding onto an existing facility, the end user customer is much more involved with that because they're already on site running their plant or their hospital or whatnot. So understanding, say you have a new evaporative condenser on a system. that is being tied into a bank of them already. If you're going to want to passivate that, the conversation needs to be brought up that, hey, maybe we have to isolate this for a certain period of time and treat that separately before it's tied in. Because most people think that they can just slap on a piece of equipment, open the valves, and we're up and running. And while that might work sometimes, that's normally not the case.
One of our best passivations, we worked with this company and they actually set up the cooling tower and put a pump on it in the middle of their parking lot and allowed us time without load. And folks, I can't tell you how important to get a passivation done without load is and how that works with the longevity of the passivation. But that was one of the best passivations we've ever had. The reality is most people aren't going to do something like that for you.
Yeah, I'd love to know how you convince them to do that, Trace. You must have a good marketing standpoint on that.
I
Is
think they listen to the podcast, actually.
They must, because that is the exception, not the rule.
Well, Walker, we've, I think, helped a lot of people in the Scaling Up Nation. But let's say somebody just gets 1 point from this conversation. What do you want that point to be?
Trace, if there's one thing that a water treater could walk away from our conversation today is don't be afraid to ask questions early and often when you're working with an engineering firm or a general contractor on your water treatment program. Because a lot of these questions will go unasked unless it's up to you. So always keeping in mind as well that getting it right the first time is the easiest and least painful way to a long-term successful water treatment program.
Great advice. Well, speaking of advice, we're going to shift our gears slightly. We're going to move to the lightning round. I know you're very familiar with the lightning round. So point values are triple today on the lightning round. So we're going to see how you do. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. First question. If you could go back in time and speak with your former self on your very first day as a water treater, what advice would you give yourself?
Yeah, I thought about that question for a while, Trace, and it's learning how to have hard conversations with customers. That is a very difficult skill to learn. I came from an only engineering and operations background. I had no account management skills. I had never done sales in my life. But learning to have hard conversations with customers, because once you do it, you'll never regret having that conversation.
What are the last few books that you've read?
Trace, I wish I could tell you that I was more of an avid reader, but I will say the last book I read, I was a little bit late to the game, but was Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. It's a great book detailing, choosing the harder path might result in a better life.
You mentioned earlier the expression extreme ownership. Have you read that book?
I have. I've read that a few times. I think one thing many guests on your podcast allude to is, audiobooks and podcasts. Those are crucial for a good water treater. And so, yeah, the Jocko book, Extreme Ownership, I've listened to that a few times.
Yeah, that's actually a book we're reading in the Rising Tide Mastermind. And one of our members knows Jocko, so we're hoping that he makes an appearance for us.
Oh, wow. That'd be exciting.
Well, speaking of that, if Hollywood makes a movie about Walker, who do you want cast as you?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I've always thought about your guests and how they answer that. I think the era I grew up in, one of my favorite shows growing up, and one of my biggest memories would be The Office, the show The Office. So I'm choosing John Krasinski as the person playing me in a movie.
Yeah, and how about his career? He went from playing an office worker to Jack Ryan as Spy. I mean, how cool is that?
Absolutely. He's writing his movies now, and maybe that'll be my career someday.
There you go. Final question. If you could talk with anybody throughout history, who would it be with and why?
So, Trace, I'm an avid hockey fan, hockey player. Still pick up the stick every now and again and play in an adult league. So, if you're an Office fan listening to this is going to even go in with the Office theme. Is the person I'd talk to be Wayne Gretzky?
Yeah, I remember he quoted Wayne Gretzky, and then he had a quote that said Michael Scott, Wayne Gretzky. Yeah.
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott.
There we go. I can still remember that. I think that was when he went out and he started his own paper company. Okay, now we've turned this into an office episode. Walker, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, but not only coming on the podcast, saying, hey, this is a deficiency within the Scaling Up Nation. This is something that we need to talk about on the podcast. So handing me a note at an AWT event and then coming on the podcast to make sure that we corrected that wrong. Walker, thanks so much.
Thank you for this, Trace. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Walker. And Nation, let that be a lesson to you if you are in the lunch line at a conference and you have an idea for me. Chances are you are going to be a guest on the Scaling Up H2O podcast. We have had so many wonderful guests over the years. And of course, we're going to have so many wonderful guests for the years to come. Just so excited that in just 2 episodes, I'm going to be celebrating episode 400 with all of you, the Scaling Up Nation. And of course, without you, we would not have an audience. We would not have a community. So I personally want to thank you not only for listening to this podcast, but sharing it with so many other people. We're close to 20,000 listeners in 96 countries. We won an award with the AWT, the Association of Water Technologies, this year for excellence and innovation for this podcast. And just so many wonderful things have happened because you are doing so many great things by listening and sharing this podcast. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you, but I don't want you to stop. I want you to keep listening. I want you to keep sharing that because I know we have a ton of water treaters out there that we have not reached yet. And I hope that inspired you. And if that didn't, I know this will, because James McDonald comes to us each and every week, inspiring us to learn something more. Here's James.
Welcome to Drop by Drop with James, the podcast segment where we wonder, explore, think about, imagine, and learn industrial water treatment, you guessed it, drop by drop, together. In today's episode, I'm on my soapbox. Oh yeah. My soapbox topic is conductivity versus TDS, or total dissolved solids. You might have expected something a little meatier, but conductivity and TDS are often used interchangeably. Far too often they are. They are not the same thing, though. Conductivity and TDS may be related, but they measure 2 completely different things. Conductivity measures the ability of a water solution to conduct an electrical current. It is quick and easily automated, only requiring a conductivity probe and a meter. Total dissolved solids, or TDS, on the other hand, is the concentration of dissolved solids in a water solution. Measuring the TDS requires evaporating a volume of water to dryness and weighing the solids that remain. TDS takes a lot more time and labor to perform than a conductivity test. So how are conductivity and TDS related? The conductivity of water is determined by the type and concentration of dissolved solids. Low TDS solutions typically have lower conductivities. High TDS solutions typically have higher conductivities. There can be a relationship between the two. If the water quality is consistent, conductivity can provide a practical way to monitor the TDS, but this relationship should be verified regularly. Some of you may be thinking, but my handheld meter displays the answer in TDS. What gives? Your handheld meter is doing math internally to convert from conductivity, which it is actually measuring, to TDS. It is not actually measuring TDS. As a rule of thumb, in the industrial water samples we often see, the actual TDS is typically 65 to 75% of the measured conductivity. This can vary, however, depending upon the ions in the water. I'm James McDonald, and I want to encourage you to be like water by forming bonds with those around you, dissolving new knowledge, and making worthy ripples, drop by drop.
Thank you, James. I don't know if you all have been to my math class for AWT, but I actually joke about the subject that James just mentioned, total dissolved solids. And I have a little picture of a meter that I show, and it says conductivity, and then it says total dissolved solids. And I say, hey, what happens when you hit this button? And people say, hey, it takes the TDS. Well, as James just explained, maybe not. So the actual procedure for total dissolved solids is after you get your sample, you've got to filter out any suspended solids, and then you weigh an evaporation dish along with what you want to evaporate. You have a specific volume that you put in there. And then you actually start to evaporate it. Typically, that's slightly over 100 degrees Celsius. And you do that until there's no moisture remaining. You cool the dish, and then you reweigh the dish. And then, of course, you subtract the initial from the final, and that gives you the overall total dissolved solids. Now, that being said, I asked the question in my math class, when you hit that TDS button, what happens? And I've got a little image where a little elf pops out and he does this little procedure and then he goes back into your meter. Well, James let the cat out of the bag. No, that's not really what happens. It takes a percentage of the conductivity. And Nation, there's some tests, there's some reasons out there in industrial water treatment that you need to know those exact numbers. For things like calcium carbonate and other scaling indices, it is minute the differences that those cause. So maybe you don't need to know that whole procedure, but I do think you need to know when you need it. So please listen to James, know what your tests are actually telling you, and know what the final number is that you're actually getting. Nation, I think when you understand the results of everything that you test, you can be the best water treater you can be. Don't ever take that for granted. If you don't understand what's going on in the directions or how you got a specific number, don't let that end there. Investigate it. Find out more. That is what makes this industry fun, because now we're not just doing tasks. We are solving problems. We're solving mysteries. We're trying to figure out before we get a test result what's going on, and then knowing what our tests are doing, we are confirming or disproving what we think is going on. And Nation, I absolutely love that. I also love bringing you a brand new episode each and every Friday. And of course, we'll have another one for you next week. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy learning how to do a total dissolved solids test. Maybe you actually run one this week, and I'll be with you next week. Take care, everybody. There's no doubt about it. Taking the Certified Water Technologist examination is one of the most challenging tasks you'll do in your water treatment career. But I'm here to help you with the first step. And that first step is my free gift to you, and that is a free CWT prep course. That's right. If you go to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep, you'll get a portion of the paid course where you can see the type of materials that you'll be working with if you decide to sign up for the full course. Again, this is my free gift to you to get you on the journey to getting your Certified Water Technologist designation. Go to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep today.